I'll go ahead and start just because I want to be kind of conscientious of everyone's time because I know how busy it is and with everything going on. So this is the first of 5 different conversations that we're having that's focused on something we're calling a road to pluralism. If you joined us last week, I do see some familiar faces. We spoke about the idea of how we can, how people, what the relationship is with national news coverage used by local news organizations. And we had a really, really great conversation with people at the local level and at the national level who work for some of these wire services, just talking about things we can do to help build trust in that coverage, things local news organizations can do, things that the wire services can do. And we're continuing that conversation beyond just that conversation that was last week. So this week, what we are going to talk about is generalizations and journalist contribution to polarization. And so the idea is that when journalists use catch-all phrases, descriptions, or labels that can make people feel oversimplified, or if we place people into one-size-fits-all categories, are they likely to trust us? And what we are finding is that the use of those catch-all phrases, those kind of broad labels, when we paint people with a broad brush, that is not increasing trust in our journalism and in the content that we produce. And this can be true for organizations, for religions, for opinions, for causes, for racial groups, for political affiliation. The list goes on and on. So we are now here to talk about what are those generalizations? How are we contributing to that polarization? And what are things that we can do to stop using generalizations potentially, to stop contributing to that polarization, to then help build trust? And this road to pluralism started after we interviewed conservative-leaning Americans in different cities around the country. And some of these themes have kind of come back out of the feedback and the research that we learned from those individuals. And so we are going to dig a little deeper into that theme today of generalization and polarization in journalism. One thing also in addition, when we talk about polarization is journalists often gravitate toward dramatic or extreme views. And we believe this can reinforce kind of that polarizing narrative. So the big question today, and I'll put this in the chat that we kind of want to talk about is how can journalists resist the allure of lazy narratives and tell more accurate, more complex stories about the spectrum of perspectives in their communities? So that's there for us to think about. I do have 3 great newsroom partners with us that will be talking. They participated in the surveys with the conservatives in their communities. So I'm going to introduce them and then also have them talk a little bit about what they heard from the people that they interviewed. First, though, I do want to put a link in here. If you're curious or you haven't been paying attention to A Road to Pluralism, this is that link to that Google, the Google form there is going to show you basically a little bit about what it is, a little bit more about the research. And so you can kind of click through there if you want to get a little more insight there. So, but now let's hear from the journalists who participated, 4 of the journalists who participated in those surveys with conservatives. And so we have Arnessa Garrett with the Dallas Morning News. We have Mike Cannon with WCPO in Cincinnati. And then we have Susan Potter and Sean McIntosh with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And Arnessa, I'm going to start with you just because you're kind of the first person in my row here. And I'm wondering if you can first introduce yourself, tell a little bit about what your role is there in Dallas. And then the question I'm hoping you can answer is just how does the challenge of generalization and polarization show up in your work and with your audience? And if you have any specific examples of feedback you've heard, I'd love to hear that.
Yes, thank you, Lynn. Yeah, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Yeah, I do, my role here at the Dallas Morning News, now I'm the interim news vertical editor, which is basically the Metro editor, but we cover a variety of issues. And I think I was just talking to you today about the Texas heartbeat bill that the Supreme Court declined to block last night. That is one of the issues that we're covering today. But during our participation with the Trusting News Initiative, what was really striking to me is that a lot of people commented on our immigration coverage, and that issue, as you know, can be very polarizing. But as you stated, people were not so far on either side of banning immigration totally or building a wall or letting everybody in. I think they wanted us to understand, especially on that issue, that, you know, it is a complex issue. People who are, you know, kind of painted as being anti-immigration are really trying to tell us that they just want a more orderly system of letting people into the country. And, you know, that was very eye-opening to me. And I talked to, you know, our immigration reporters about that. And it was kind of, you know, a little bit of a shift in our coverage in that, you know, we cover a lot of the things that are happening on the border with just breaking news. Like, yeah, there's an order to stop transport of migrants or whatever. But I think there also needs to be a broader look at what does immigration mean to our country? What are we trying to achieve with our immigration policy? And they were, you know, they were pretty on board with that. And so I think it was very instructive to have that information from readers.
Thanks so much, Arnessa. Mike, I'll go to you next. And again, if you don't mind introducing yourself, what you do there at WCPO briefly, and then talking about how you've seen the kind of concept of generalization, polarization show up in your work and the feedback you've maybe received from your audience about that.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. Again, I'm Mike Cannon. I'm the news director at WCPO here in Cincinnati. And so, you know, one of the things that was really interesting to me when I sat down to have these conversations with folks who are right-leaning, I heard a lot of the things that I usually hear, right? Like, you only cover part of the story, you're in the Democrats' pocket, like, you know, we just want the facts, don't put your opinions in there. All that sort of like general stuff that we hear sort of day in, day out from people who do or don't understand what we do. But what I heard that was really different in, I think, all three of the sessions that I did, or four, I can't remember how many I did, it's been a while now, was that we generalize to the point of stereotyping conservatives. And that's no different than if we were to stereotype people by race or by geographic origin or anything like that. And that, you know, we, meaning the media, I guess, so they're stereotyping us, but we tend to label all conservatives as if they're, you know, Trump supporters who are racist, who you know, have no bend or give at all, and that the point was that we're not a monolith. The conservatives are all across the board, and in fact, the people that I talked to, in fact, I think that was from my end, one of the struggles was to find that sort of like dyed-in-the-wool Fox News watcher who, you know, that's all they watch, and they, you know, they believe every word that Fox News says and everyone else is terrible, kind of thing. None of those folks were really willing to actually have a conversation with me, apparently. But the folks that I watched were really omnivores in their news consumption and had, in some cases, wildly different views than you would expect if you just went by sort of a stereotype. I mean, the one guy was in finance, and that's why he considered himself so conservative, but he was incredibly socially liberal on all kinds of topics. And he said, you know, no one reflects me in their news coverage of conservatives. And I thought that was a really interesting and sort of poignant comment. And then the other thing that I would just say is, it really reminded me, I think in the research or in an interview or something like this, I talked about this of, I have relatives who live in rural Northeast Ohio, and they're all conservative. And this was shortly after the election. A reporter from a large national news organization that I will not name came to their county and did a story on what people in rural Northeast Ohio think about such and such after the election. And I just remember they're actually relatives of my wife, were like, this is exactly what's wrong with journalism. They came here and they talked to like 3 people who may or may not reflect the community in any way. And then they make these broad generalizations that doesn't fit the reality that these folks see in their everyday lives. And yet now this national media organization has painted that whole county with this broad brush of this is how people here think and act. And that's sort of what these folks who I talked to at least were saying, like, you're painting all these conservatives with a broad brush as if we're all the same, and we really aren't. And no one deserves to be painted with a broad brush for 1 or 2 characteristics of their life. And so I think that was really telling and poignant. We have had a lot of conversations in our newsroom since then about avoiding generalizations just overall. Like, how do we, whether it's conservative, liberal, or anything else, how do we avoid taking the conversation of, 1 or 2 people and making that as if those people speak for everyone? And I think that it's helped us just to have those conversations, but I think there's a lot more that needs to be done, both here at a single newsroom level, but also at an industry-wide level.
Thanks, Mike. And I really appreciate how both you and Nessa have talked about how you've already kind of had these conversations based in your newsroom, based on what you've learned to try to make changes. And toward the end, I'm going to come back and we're going to talk more about that. And I think also something that Mike said is important to point out, that broad brush, it applies to so many things. I mean, how many stories, as a millennial myself, I see so many stories that they talk to 2 or 3 people and they're like, well, millennials think this, or millennials think that, or baby boomers this. I mean, it goes beyond politics. It's race, it's ethnicity, it's religious affiliation, it's even where people live. Oh, California liberals, right? That's where I'm based. So I think it's what we're trying to get at in pluralism is like, there are all these things that we do with these generalizations, right? It's beyond the politics too. And so how can we improve that in so many aspects of our community? And so next I'm going to go to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution group. So Sean and Susan, I don't know which one of you would like to go first, but I'd love to hear, I know both of you did speak with conservatives there in and outside of Atlanta. So would love to hear what you heard related to generalization and polarization.
Sure. I'm gonna let Susan go first because she's where the rubber meets the road.
Okay.
So first of all, I'm the politics editor at the paper, and as you may or may not know about Georgia, it is a super divided state. I mean, the election couldn't have been any closer here. I think we have become a true toss-up state, which means we have some very obviously our politics are very divided and people have very strong feelings about everything. And that is a generalization, but I have seen that over and over again. I don't think that is a partisan thing. I think it's just a fact of life here. I heard many of the same things from the people I talked to. And I will say that I was heartened in some way because the people I talked to were open to us, were appreciative of some of the work that we do to some degree, to a large degree in some cases, but saw some weaknesses that they wanted to call out. I will also say that I think that the people who agreed to the interviews may not have been reflective. It's hard for me to know how reflective they are of conservatives in Georgia, because we do talk to lots and lots of people. We do polling. We don't just rely on polling, but we go out into the communities. We talk to folks. and we hear a range of views. But I know Sean did talk to someone who was less enthralled with us, and it is representative of a someone who is more along the media dislike. I'm trying to find a way of saying this that it's not generalizing, but she doesn't like the media at all, and thinks that we are terrible and so forth. But the folks I talked to were a lot like the conservatives we come in contact at the State House. A lot of them, you know, the people who we interview all the time. And the theme, it was the same theme. They don't all want to be painted it with the same brush, and they wanted us to understand that there are a range of views, and even though they may have one common action of voting a certain way, their reasons are very different, and they aren't all Trump lovers, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that was an important thing to keep in mind. I don't feel like we do a terrible job of painting people with a broad brush, but it does happen. And it happens in really unintentional ways. On the same theme, the language that we use in reporting, it's interesting to me how it can be interpreted. I mean, there was an example, and it's in the report. Someone I talked to, one of our big stories of last year was the voting law that the state legislature passed. And it is a big law. It has many, many, many aspects to it. It does a lot of stuff, and we refer to it as sweeping. And that was a word that really represented something to some of our readers that we were not aware of. And, you know, it's a good reminder to be super careful in our language and think about how something might, but honestly, I hadn't thought that would be regarded in a negative way, but I can see the point. So we don't use that anymore. So we have made some adjustments in our reporting and our writing, but I think the larger point is just having an awareness and being mindful of the fact that people are not all the same, even if they voted in a particular way.
Sean, what do you have to add from your conversations?
Well, I would endorse what was said before about people want to see a range of views, and I just would acknowledge I'm a managing editor in the newsroom, and I guess 80% of my job is trying to find enough people to do all the work every day. And so I just have to acknowledge that that's damn near impossible. You know, you're writing a story and you're trying to illuminate both sides of a debate over a piece of legislation about voting rights. And let's be honest, it boils down to two sides. One is there's vote suppression going on and you shouldn't be doing this. And the other is there's cheating at the polls and we should stop it. And so you have to quickly represent those views, and to say we're going to represent the full complexity of everybody and the full range of views every time is damn near impossible. But what I think I learned we could do better is say that every time, and say the people we interviewed most closely aligned with the hardened, you know, right position of the lawmakers, or we sought out people who felt strongly about this issue, or some kind of transparency and disclosure. I talked to two people, and both of them, interestingly enough, felt that they were not reflected, and that the other one was. You know, you only show Republicans like that extreme right wing, you know, really agitated about everything. That's what one of them said. And then the other one said, You never write about me, the extreme right wing, extremely agitated. What I mostly learned, I think this is going to sound more dismissive than I mean it to, and I'm trying to find a more respectful and inclusive way to say it. But what I mostly learned is these people are aggrieved. They believe the media is out to mislead about them, and they're looking for coded language and framing and things that are designed to paint them in a bad light, because they believe that's what we're doing. And so they're looking for that. And when we give it to them, we are feeding a narrative. And it's like Susan said, sweeping is not a word we would ever think of as loading up their gun with ammunition against us. But apparently some of them took that as a thing that was improper. So I think every word choice we make has to be made with great care. And some of it out of respect and inclusion and because it's the right thing to do, and some of it out of what I call defensive editing. Don't give people ammunition to dismiss the story before they get to the fifth graph.
Thank you, Susan and Sean. And I think, word choice is something that came up often with the generalization, that the grouping idea, right? You're kind of broadly kind of grouping people into with one word or two words. But it definitely comes up in the polarization, and it's something that hasn't come up as much from Arnessa, Mike, Susan, and Sean. But something else that is part of this theme that we want to talk about is how is the language that we use, specifically more so in headlines and social posts and summaries, are we using language that contributes to that polarization? So it reminds me a lot of when you see headlines that say something like, there's a fight happening in Congress, or the battle, they're battling it out. And we make it this we kind of tee up this situation of there's a winner and a loser. And like, I guess, yes, there is, but instead, could it be more about the actual thing that's being voted on and about what the process is and about what the outcome is? And by us kind of highlighting and focusing and using words like fight, battle, win, lose, are we adding to that polarization? And I do think that we really are. And is that our role, and can we be better about that? That's just kind of a question that, as we talk about what we want to do with pluralism, we're trying to find how can we be better. I think something I wrote in that Medium post that Joyce showed is, Sean, to your point, we can't do this all the time necessarily, but are there ways that we can work to be better, to not overgeneralize, to not add to polarization, and what does that look like? And so one of those questions is, can we be careful with that word choice and not use words that add to polarization? And I want to open it up and hear from the rest of you. I'm going to kind of throw out that same question. And then toward the end of the call, the last like 15 minutes or so, we're going to kind of focus it more on possible solutions or things that maybe might be worth trying to make sure that we avoid generalization and polarization. So Mike, I saw that you unmuted yourself. I don't know if you wanted to say something. And then if anyone else has something to say, feel free to raise your hand and I can call on you next, or put anything in the chat as well.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. So we've done a lot of research, both at Scripps and involving WCPO on sort of similar questions around politics and political and when and what people's reactions to it and when it turns people off. And I think one of the things, not only does those types of like fight and battle and the political machinations of a story or of a political bill or law or movement or whatever, not only do those potentially help breed polarization, but I think they just turn a huge swath of the audience off. And they're like, oh, here's more of the political back and forth and bickering. I'm going to go into it guns a-blazing, or peace out, I want nothing to do with that. And so I think we have to be careful of those types of framings of the story, because I think we lose the audience and we potentially lose the story. So many, especially when it comes to national politics, so many stories are framed around the political battle. It's no wonder that that the audience is looking for those moments where we stray in a word choice here or there, because they're coming in immediately thinking this story is going to be about one side or another, because it's about the political battle and the fight, not about whatever the issue is.
Thanks, Mike. Arnessa?
Yes, I think anti is a word that we use a lot in headlines that is very loaded for people. And I didn't realize, I mean, it's just a shorthand for us, but, anti-immigration bill. But, again, they pointed out, like, I'm not against immigration totally. I'm against this particular policy that's being passed in the legislature. And, that was kind of a little bit of an eye opener. It's like, okay, if we say anti-immigration bill, is it tending to say something that we don't intend it to say?
Thanks, Arnessa. That's a really great example, specifically tying it to immigration, because I think you're right. That's just a really great example of someone who might be supporting the bill isn't necessarily anti-immigration, but if you just take those words to describe the bill, that's what it comes out as. Margot? And if you don't mind introducing yourself as well, if you haven't spoken yet, just to tell us where you're coming from and what your role is.
Sure. Margot Ashmore, publisher, Northeastern newspaper in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I just wanted to say that in general, sorry about this. Getting a lot of spam calls. The whole thing about cliches, especially in old-timey headline writing where you're writing on one column, different abbreviations like Dems and things like that. We've been trying to avoid those types of cliches, and just in general avoiding cliche writing in stories. And was also thinking that the use of the small type kicker at the top of a headline might be able to be, something more nuanced than the big screaming headline. So that might be a device that could be used more. And that's about all I had to contribute so far.
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Where else have you been seeing this kind of come up, or are there other things that haven't been mentioned? I mean, we've heard with generalizations related to polarization that you've seen in your own newsroom. Yeah, Lindsay, Mackenzie.
Sorry, I couldn't find my hand raise thing.
That's okay.
So real time worked for me. We're definitely, and I kind of dropped it into the chat, but we're seeing this polarization around vaccinations in Canada.
And sorry, do you mind introducing, where you're coming from in the publication that you work for?
Sure, absolutely.
Yes.
So I'm a community engagement producer for CBC Radio Canada, which is Canada's national public broadcaster. And I work in the local region of Manitoba. And so for our company, for our media station, we're seeing more polarization around the issue of vaccinations. So Canada has a high percentage of the population that is vaccinated, but we're now in a place where whether it's vaccine hesitancy or anti-vaccine ideology is starting to create fractures inside the newsroom, both for employees who are vaccine hesitant or anti-vaccination, and then those journalists who are not and who are on the health beat. But it's creating fractures in company culture, and then also how we can accurately reflect those perspectives while still being mindful of the sound, factual public health advice that we're being given.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and one of our themes that will happen later. I think it's in a couple weeks. We're going to talk about bias in the newsroom, and how the makeup of your newsroom can also, like, how does that influence some of these potentially, one, story selection, how we cover things, but also the words we use and the words we might be comfortable using. If you don't have someone that maybe feels the opposite way in your newsroom, you might not even be aware that that's a word that just kind of contributes to this polarization, or someone's going to see and instantly be like, I'm not reading that article because I think it's biased for XYZ reason, or I don't think they know me because they use this word, and using this word means they don't know who I am. They don't know anything about my culture. And so that's an important aspect of this as well, being able to have a newsroom where people can flag that. And so, Sean, if you don't mind answering, there was a question in the chat from Kim, and it looks like you said you can answer that question. So if you don't, you can go ahead and answer it live here by unmuting yourself, if that's okay.
Sure. I'm not sure I can answer it, but I'll do my best. Kim asked if our no surprises journalism policy has helped build trust and engagement. No surprises for us is it's pretty much a long-standing, I guess I'd call it best practice. Our lawyers don't like to call it a policy, but that people have a right to know what you're going to say about them, or what you're going to accuse them of, or what you're going to, in glancing mention about them before it comes out in a publication online or in print. We try to do that every chance we get. There are opportunity chances you can't, police announce an arrest. You can't say, let me hold up on that until I call and ask them if they know they've been arrested, right? But we try. We've had that practice grew primarily out of investigations, which is the area I've been most involved in over the years. Because back in the old days of investigative reporting, and I remember this so well, I used to go to workshops at IRE where we had what we called the showdown interview, where you would go and, isn't it true, Mr. So-and-so, that you cheated such and such? And we just try not to do that. We try to get as far ahead of the story as we can and let people know what we're going to say. I really don't have any research or any sense that it has built trust over time. I don't know that we reveal it enough in our stories to people. We do try to say we called them several times. The main thing I think I have evidence of is it does make for better stories, because people are more likely to talk to us if we let them know right up front, here's what we're working on, or here's what we're reporting. And we do try even up to the end on like big investigative packages. We'll even call and say, okay, you still don't have to talk to us, but let us tell you what we're going to say anyway, so that you're not surprised. And people appreciate that. And at that point, they often say, oh, well, if that's what you're going to say, let me answer. And so it does get better, fairer stories, I know, but I don't know if it's actually changed readers' perception.
Thanks, Sean. And Kim, I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, feel free to follow up if you have more to ask about that. So something that we are, hoping to do with this is come up with possible solutions to how can we stop generalizing? How can we not contribute to polarization? And so while doing that, I'm going to put in some questions. I'm going to first call on Mike, Arnessa, Susan, and Sean to see. Mike and Arnessa, you both have sort of mentioned some things you've already done in your newsroom, but I'd love to hear any ideas you might have moving forward of what you might want to try to do to see if it makes a difference, or something you may be willing to try. And while they're talking, I'm going to put some questions in the chat that we are also kind of hoping to answer that can kind of help us come to these solutions, right? So this idea of, if we want to stop adding, how do we emphasize extreme views? If we want to stop doing that, we need to first kind of find out how we're doing it. And then is there anything we can change to go in the opposite direction? So I'm going to go in the same order, if that's okay. Arnessa, I'll go to you if you want to share just maybe things you've already implemented or talked about, and things maybe you hope to be able to try or want to try.
Yeah, thank you. Like I said, we've talked, to our immigration reporters about these kinds of issues, especially regarding, what is going on now, specifically with younger migrants. I think, we also have to realize that, journalists are humans too, and they're covering these really, really heartbreaking stories. And, I don't want to minimize what they are trying to convey to people that they may not already know. And so we do have, a number of journalists who are, just trying to tell human stories. And, we want to encourage that. I think, for us, it's been, how can we expand this coverage? How can we tell a more nuanced picture of what's going on? How can we broaden the conversation, frankly, from just migrants coming across the border on that issue? On other issues, I think, there's been, newsroom conversations about just, we need to not paint people with a broad brush, kind of what we've all been saying. Especially, last night, with the Texas abortion law, we need to represent in our coverage, and we always try to do this, of course, the views of people who, may not be aligned with the thinking on this abortion law, and we need to make sure we represent that accurately. We always try to get those voices and stories, but I think more and more the important part is to get the nuance of those voices. It's not just pro-life, pro-choice. It is, people who honestly feel that looking at the technology that we have today to see, a fetal heartbeat is something that even changed their minds, So one of the stories we're working on for the weekend is that this whole abortion debate has not always been seen as a moral issue. It hasn't always been a religious battle. And one thing that, one of the pastors told us was that, with the technology that we have today, that changed his view on it. And I'm like, okay, well, we need to represent that opinion, and not just saying that opinion is like a reflex. It's like those opinions have also evolved. And we don't always recognize that there's, there's some thinking behind these conservative positions. It's not just reflexive anti-abortion, anti-this, anti-that. It's like there are people who have actually looked at evidence or, things that they consider would change their opinion. And so we're trying to reflect that.
Thank you so much, Arnessa. Mike, anything, you mentioned a couple things, conversations you've had in the newsroom, but anything that you have actually kind of tried to implement and or really, really want to implement to try to solve maybe some of this?
Nothing that we've implemented beyond just having conversations, but I think I'd love to spend some time, and I just don't have the bandwidth for it at the moment, but tackling like, what are our policies around when we sort of allow the people we spoke to speak for a larger group? Even something simple like, when you go to a neighborhood because something happened in that neighborhood and we say, neighbors here say blah, blah, blah. Well, how many neighbors did you talk to? And do they all say that? Like, I think we need to, it's clunkier and more awkward wording, but I think we need to say the neighbors that we talk to here say, assuming they all say the same thing, versus the neighbors here say, or the people in this town say. And so I think there's a couple layers of steps to build in not only the training to get everyone on the right page of that's what we're going to do now, but also to sort of have the level of checks and balances there.
Or the 3 people we tried to talk to, and 2 of them wouldn't, and this one did. So we're saying he speaks for the neighborhood.
Exactly. I mean, I remember years ago going to it was like a community council group or something like that, and we were talking about what we did, and you know, these people from this neighborhood, it's sort of like a transitioning neighborhood going from, you know, relatively low income, high crime to, you know, maybe not gentrified exactly, but more, you know, middle class. And this woman said, yeah, you guys only come to our neighborhood when there's a crime. And not that I've never heard that before, but she was probably right. But she said, beyond that, when you do, you find the one crazy guy that everyone else in the block thinks, oh, there's Ted, he's crazy again. And of course, he's the only one who's going to walk up to your person with a camera and start talking on camera about what terrible crime happened in the neighborhood. That guy is the last guy we want to represent our neighborhood. If we were taking a vote, he would get 0 votes. And yet here's the one who you guys represent the neighborhood with. So it's stuff like that too.
Thanks, Mike. I think that's something that I wrote in the Medium post. Part of, I think this is like, what are our news processes that we have that contribute to this generalization and the polarization? In like working in television myself, that's been my experience, you know, it's the deadline and that you need someone to talk on camera. So if you're in the moment, someone's willing to talk, you sometimes don't do all the checks and balances maybe you need to do, or you need someone on camera. So you just let the Ted in the neighborhood talk when it might not be the most representative. And so the question about that, when we look at that, it's like, are we willing to change our processes and make changes in what our journalism looks like, to maybe then we don't have any neighbors talk because we don't really feel like we could find anyone that represented the neighborhood, or we couldn't talk to enough people? Or to what Mike and Sean both kind of also mentioned, you know, are we willing to say, we spoke to 2 people and that have these views and they said X, Y, and Z. And the headline then isn't going to be generalized and saying, you know, people in the Ocean Beach neighborhood think, it's 2 people in Ocean Beach think. And then if we're willing to try that, what does that mean then to the audience? Like, if we're willing to do that, does the audience notice? Does it help build trust? Are they then going to accuse us potentially of maybe not talking to enough people? I don't know. That's something that I'm wondering if we're willing to try and what that would look like.
I think that's definitely a challenge, right? And having worked in newspapers, digital, and TV, I'll tell you that not only do TV reporters have the least amount of time to gather, but they also have the least amount of time as far as news hole. So, you know, you don't have time as a TV reporter, like the physical time to do 8 interviews, but you also know you only have space for probably 1 neighbor, right? So, you know, the good TV reporters find some way to talk to 8 people and then find a good person that actually is representative. But that's not always feasible and not always possible in every story. And it makes this type of approach incredibly difficult.
Thank you. Sean or Susan, anything that you've kind of out of this implemented in your newsroom or want to try, even if it's kind of a thing you're like, I don't know if we'll be able to do it, but I'd love to see it happen?
Well, one thing I wanted to mention is the conversations we have about story selection now and whether we're going to cover something or not, and give time and space to a particular view. We have become very selective. We have a member of Congress who is very outspoken and would get, you know, 1 million page views if we wrote every crazy thing that she says, but we don't. I mean, we don't cover most of what she says and does. To be honest, we did a step back piece recently because we had accumulated some reporting, and she was doing something different that we felt important to tell people about. And we have to weigh this. I mean, the people of her district need to know what she's doing, right? The people of the state need to know that. But at the same time, we don't have to, you know, every utterance share, even though there's, you know, it'll get a lot of attention. So that is, using restraint sometimes is a way of combating this. And also, there was a story we ran that I just loved. That was an as told to story we ran Sunday before last, I guess. It's a wonderful piece about a woman who didn't want to get the vaccine, and she finally did, but it just walked you, it was 100% her voice, and it walked through her struggles and where she was getting her information and how worried she was and thoughtful. She was thoughtful about it all. And it was a lovely, important story because it was the opposite of generalizing or stereotyping a certain person for their view. It shed light on, and it was without us getting in the way of it and interpreting what she said. It was her words. So that was a story I love, and finding ways to tell stories that are more nuanced, that let people tell you how they feel when you describe them, instead of using a label saying who believes X, Y, Z. And that's also a more accurate way of doing it. I will also say that that's very hard to do in some stories. And I think there are some stories that I don't know how you get away. There are some stories that are about a competition. Elections are competitions. And it's very nice to say, oh, everything can't be about the battle or the fight, but it is a fight. And it's naive, I think. It's not that we can't be aware of that and be careful and show some restraint in how we do it. But there are times when I think that is called for. So that may not be a popular view, but that is the world I live in, so.
No, thank you, Susan. I appreciate you sharing that. Sean, anything to add? And then I want to go to Lisa, who raised her hand a little bit ago. So go ahead.
Yeah, I think that, and this is coming to me largely from this discussion and the discussion of the last few weeks, but I think I want us to think more deeply about when do we go get those, as we call them, human voices in the story, and are we getting them just because we expect a quote in the third graph, and is one quote in one interview really enough, or are we spending time tracking this woman down? I put the story that Susan mentioned in the link, tracking this woman down and really telling her story deeply and giving a fair and nuanced view of even one person, but one person who represents so many and all the conflicts she feels. So I want us to just think more about what I'm going to call human voice or man on the street. If we bother to go to a neighborhood to ask what people in the neighborhood think, then to me that should be a real story about what people think, not a throwaway quote in a news story. And maybe we could live without throwaway quotes in news stories. That's a big challenge, to have a news story without a human voice, but maybe we've got to think about that.
Thank you, Sean. I really like that. And thank you for throwing that out there. I think it's definitely something to think about. And Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of things. And I forget who started the conversation. Maybe it was one of your questions in terms of trying to focus us on solutions, Lynn. But I think we have to be careful about thinking about, should we not include the voices of individuals that we find in neighborhoods or residents? Because I think when you have kind of a general mindset of not including them, that says that we value certain voices over other voices. And often that tends to be, quite frankly, racial minorities. In some cases, it could be women. And so I think we have to be careful about that. I know I'm Print, by the way, Journal Gazette newspaper in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'm sorry, I did not introduce that context. I can imagine TV has a harder time because often there are opportunities to do live reports, and there is a danger in just grabbing what I call average Joe or average Josephine and going live, because you don't have much opportunity to vet them. They may say, I saw something, but you don't even really know whether they actually witnessed something. So there is more of a challenge there, certainly, that I can appreciate that the broadcast journalists have to deal with. So I think journalists recognize views that can be extreme. And when you have an extreme view because you've grabbed the average person or the available willing person, then you have to determine how can you balance that? What's another source? And be leery in those situations of going with just one voice. And I also appreciate what Susan was just saying about, yes, there are times where things are definitely fights. Someone wins or loses. And so sometimes we have to use that language. And I think it's also important to remember that there are times where we don't have to use that language because some things are clear. If there is a race for a Senate seat, we know someone is going to win and someone is going to lose. We know it's a battle. We know it's a fight. We know it's a race. So we don't always have to use some of that language, and maybe in more general stories that get beyond races and elections, often just by saying what people said and sharing their viewpoints, it becomes clear that there is conflict. Conflict, the reality, is one of the things that drives journalism, different viewpoints. But I think oftentimes there may be language that makes that clear to the readers. So it goes back to the show me, don't tell me, just show it through the comments and the context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And thanks everyone for this conversation. We are kind of coming up here to the end, so I don't want to keep people longer. But the good news is, if we want to continue this conversation and you feel like this is something you want to work on in your newsroom and you want to be a part of kind of brainstorming maybe possible solutions or experiments, we really encourage you to join our Pluralism Network. I'm going to put a link right there in the chat. So our whole idea with this is, one, to have these conversations, and then we're going to continue them on Slack, in a Slack space. So once you join the Pluralism Network, you're invited into the Slack space, and we really want to come up with things to try. So for this, maybe we are going to have a couple newsrooms that say, if we only talked with 2 people, we're always going to say 2 people. We're not going to say neighbors said. We're going to specifically say 2 neighbors said X. Or 1 neighbor said this, another said that. Maybe that's something that we have newsrooms commit to, and we see, like, did the public notice? Is it something that they noticed, and did it help build trust, right? So we're looking to brainstorm what some of those possible solutions could be for this. And so if you want to participate or you have some ideas, please apply so you can join that and continue this conversation. The same goes with all of the themes. If you're interested in talking more about the use of national news and its impact on local news, and or just how to show the value of local news, which is kind of the other side of that, please join. Moving forward, we have 3 more conversations coming. Next week, we are going to talk about the perceptions of stories' fairness. This has a lot to do with how are stories written? What context are we providing and focusing on? This also relates to something, I think it was Mike that brought it up, just people say, we want just the facts. We don't want interpretation. And if you give them interpretation, are you telling them that it's interpretation? How are we labeling that? Are we being clear about that it is opinion or that it is an analysis? And what does analysis even mean? So that's what we're going to talk about next week. Same time, if you registered for this, you have a link to join that. And then the other conversations that are coming after that are going to focus on outreach. And then Joy, remind me of the other one I'm missing. Bias in the newsroom. Yes. So those will be the last 3 conversations in this. So we hope you will join us. I really appreciate everyone's time. Special thanks to Susan, Sean, Mike, and Arnessa. Really appreciate you being here and continuing to support the project. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. So good to see you guys. Thanks for making time.